folks. Welcome to the latest edition of the Red Letters Dialogues podcast. So glad that you can join us. I must admit that reading this op-ed on the Huffington Post written by Lecrae, it made my blood boil when I first read it a few days ago. But thankfully, the dust has settled in my own mind. And the more I began to analyze the words postulated by and written by Lecrae and promoted here by the Huffington Post, the more there is to pick apart, due to the fact that there are multiple contradictions, lies, ignorance, things that Lecrae is accusing other people of being when they disagree with his posture on the matter of race relations. Now, most of you know that Lecrae has become sort of a hit with many Christians and in many Christian circles. Now, curiously enough, one would think that since he is a hip-hop artist, as they are known nowadays, that the people that would mostly consume his so-called music would be people of a similar skin tone, blacks in particular. But that's not the case, as is the case with secular hip-hop, if it can be differentiated from Christian hip-hop. The truth is, the majority of persons whom consume that music, buy the albums, etc., are white persons. And this is something that is also alluded to by the Huffington Post in another article that I will quote. But anyways, I'm reading this, and I'm seeing that Lecrae has a bone to pick with people whom supposedly don't understand where he's coming from. And the more I read this, the more sanctimony, the more condescension I see emanating from this person, and I think it's absolutely necessary to examine this in the name of preserving accurately what true Christianity is. Because as I've stated before, people like Lecrae, artists so-called like Lecrae, they use Jesus Christ as a pedestal to promote things that are absolutely fallacious, and in some cases, such as this, pernicious. And they do damage to the gospel because they misrepresent what the gospel is all about. Now, the article that he writes, again, and this is published by the Huffington Post or through the Huffington Post, "The pains of humanity have been draining me." And I could read the entirety of it for you from the get-go, but I'd like to take this line by line, if possible, to try to examine what it is that he is implying, and also to scrutinize his words. We are called to employ discernment. Hebrews 5:14, Philippians 1:9, Jesus says in John 7:24 that we ought to judge with righteous judgment, etc., so that we may protect ourselves from those that are trying to deceive us, and even those whom are ignorant and have espoused points of view and ideologies that are based in lies that could also deceive us. So in both ends, persons whom are charlatans, and they employ their charlatanism to deceive people, and then individuals whom are ignoramuses, blind leading the blind into the ditch sort of thing. We have to protect ourselves from both entities. Now, let's begin by analyzing the title of this op-ed. "The pains of humanity have been draining me." I would like to ask Lecrae, why do you assume the weight of the world on your shoulders? Who has called you to assume the weight of the world on your shoulders? I think Jesus Christ did that more than effectively. And you're trying to carry the burdens of an entire culture or subset of a culture, to me, seems to indicate that you think very highly of yourself. And yes, I am referring myself directly to Lecrae. And people like him, by the way, whom consider themselves leaders and spokespersons for these causes, when I don't happen to see that anyone in particular asked or demanded these people to represent them as a collective. Because I'll tell you one thing, Lecrae doesn't speak for me when he says Christianity or he says Jesus. He doesn't represent me, just as individuals didn't represent me when they signed evangelicals and Catholics together years ago. And yet Pat Robertson said that he was in representation of all Christians, of all churches. Well, I never asked him to represent me, and it was very presumptuous and arrogant of him to do so, and the same principle applies to Lecrae. So the pains of humanity have been draining me. No one's asked you to take the weight of the world on your shoulders, or of a subset of society on your shoulders. Surely you might be able to identify with a certain ethnic group because of your skin tone, or maybe from some particular culture or subset of culture that you emanate from, where you see something might be happening. But again, he is espousing an ideology that in reality has no basis in fact, and I would dare say blames innocent people for the misdeeds of others, which is injustice, and the Bible tells us that all injustice is sin. That's John in his epistles. All injustice is sin, and he should know this as a Christian. But then again, there's something to be said about saying you're a Christian but selectively applying Christianity, as we will see. I have mentioned before, and I'd like to mention it again, that I like to call what Lecrae and his ilk promote as racial purgatory. Why must I establish that in the beginning, and why do I call it racial purgatory? Well, all of you know I'm no Catholic, and those of you that have been following the ministry for some time now and have read enough of my writings know that I abhor the Catholic Church. It's not in any way, shape, or form associated with Christianity. History proves this, very much so. Their practices prove that they are a deviant form of religion that tries to take on the mantle of Christianity, but in reality is a perversion of the gospel. But I think the imagery applies as it pertains to the ideology that is espoused by many black racists and their ilk, even whites whom end up hating themselves and advocate for Black Lives Matter. And there are many people within the gospel world, the Christian world, and that's why I'm directing myself at this as a Christian. And I see many Christians, like Lecrae says, that he is addressing this issue from this vantage point, so I guess I'm also at the right to not concur with him and criticize him if I see that he is stepping out of line with what the Bible has to say about this. So I do have a right to speak about this, for those who might say, you have no right to speak about this, etc., etc. Anyways, the truth of the matter is I call it racial purgatory. Why? Or racist purgatory, whatever you might want to call it. Because the idea is there's never any amount of penance. There's never any amount of, what shall we call it, reparations that can be made in order to make up for the misdeeds of the past of certain persons' ancestors, which in and of itself already tells you that the ideology is unjust. Why? Because you're attributing to a new generation that has nothing to do with the sins of the past, the sins of their forefathers. And that in and of itself is unjust. Completely unjust. And then those that are subscribing culpability to those that had absolutely nothing to do with the repression of other people's fathers in the past, they act as if they were the recipients of that evil, when that is not the case. I ask Lecrae and people like Al Sharpton, Jesse Jackson, Barack Obama, Louis Farrakhan, and other individuals like them, when were you oppressed? When? How are you oppressed? Because I find that in many cases, you're living high and mightily now. Very much so. And I'll get to Lecrae's past in just a second, because I know there are people that they idolize Lecrae, and this blinds them to the hypocrisy that Lecrae is espousing. And they'll say, wait a minute, he's spoken at length and he's lyricized at length about his past. Well, we'll get to that in just a second, because there's a lot to say about that and the hypocrisy that reeks from his mouth, from his lips, from his written text, when he tries to blame other people for their criticisms of him, and then he subscribes it, he attributes it to people not understanding him, which is a very condescending thing to say if you think about it. Well, racial purgatory. There's never any amount of penance. There's never any amount of reparations that can be made in order to make up for the past, if you will. And he makes mention of that in this article, as I'll read shortly. Why? Well, because it's convenient. Think about it. It's convenient. If we can continue to blame other people for our ills, then we can continue to ask other people to subsidize our existence, which is exactly what has happened in the modern age. Under the name of these people need to make reparations, blacks and other small ethnic groups are demanding that their entire existence be subsidized. And I have a report here which proves that. The government has stepped in and tried to make reparations to the point where now fatherlessness in the black community is at an all-time high, even higher than most other ethnic groups. Why? Because since government is there to, again, subsidize their existence, who needs fathers? But the problem is when fathers are not present to rear their children and educate them and discipline them, what you have is an increase in criminality, which is the exact same thing, interesting, the exact same thing that we are seeing today emanating from the black community. The exact same thing that Lecrae lyricizes about, his past, and also condemning how many blacks behave in the present, or the way that many blacks behave in the present. That's one of the things that has attracted many people to Lecrae, from what I've seen, is that he is supposedly a truth teller, one from among them who denounces them. And yet when he joins Black Lives Matter, or he says that he subscribes to the idea of Black Lives Matter, it's a complete contradiction, because through his lyrics, he is supposedly denouncing the violence, the glorification of criminality, the promiscuity that is also glorified, the narcotics taking that is glorified in the black community and through black culture. But then he joins a group who misattributes these things to external forces. In other words, the man is keeping us down and the man is white. And we can see this racism, which is being, it's systematically employed through the police departments. So whose fault is it? Is it black culture, or is it because someone else is making you do that? Well, you know what? I was going to get to this later, but I'll mention it now because it's pertinent to what we're talking about. Lecrae has stated that when he was younger, before coming to Christ, his mentor, his idol was Tupac, a man who was a criminal. And he said that he ran drugs. He belonged to a very criminal element, impregnated a certain woman. I don't know if he had more free sex with other women. I'm not very privy to the entirety of his past, but from what I've read, he lived a very promiscuous lifestyle, very promiscuous behavior. This is what he engaged in with regularity. But I ask you, Lecrae, were those whites influencing you to do that? Or, as you said, other blacks influencing you to do that? Because if it was black culture that influenced you to do that, then you should attribute blame to where it chiefly is responsible, not to other people that have absolutely nothing to do with it. Now, let's continue reading, shall we? I was once told you shouldn't waste time explaining yourself to people bent on misunderstanding you. So I won't anymore. I can't anymore. I'm a mess. I've been grieving the loss of black lives since 2014 without consultation or consolation. I'm sorry. I was about to say, actually, wait, I think I'm reading that right. Consultation. I don't know if he meant to say consolation, but it's written consultation, which I need to figure out if that's a typo or if he actually meant to say consultation. More on that in the future. Anyways, I have some other reports here, which I think the listener and the viewer will find of absolute interest. When Philando Castile had the confrontation this year with police in Minnesota, he had this to say through Instagram. This is Lecrae. Hashtag Philando Castile. Arguments only prove my point. I will never stop justice. Side note, hashtag All Lives Matter is like spitting in the face of black folk. It comes off as extremely selfish and unsympathetic to a mourning person. Not because all lives don't matter. Of course they do. So then why do you denounce the hashtag All Lives Matter? The reason that people began to advance and continue to advance All Lives Matter is because people have seen through the racism that drives Black Lives Matter. And now you're saying, no, not all lives matter because it's an insult to blacks, but yes, all lives matter. You see, it's the proverbial trying to have both sides of the coin to try to appease critics on both ends. And you can't be a fence straddler because the fence will eventually cut you in two. And that fence being the hypocrisy, the contradiction. No one goes up to lung cancer patients and says, folks with breast cancer matter too. All cancer patients matter. If you think about it, folks, this is non sequitur. An absolutely non sequitur. Because when we are referring to all lives matter, we are making the distinguishing phrase from that which is advanced by Black Lives Matter, which is namely only blacks are systematically oppressed in this country. And it is due to racism, which is all a false narrative. That's why people have counteracted with all lives matter. Complete non sequitur. It has nothing to do with it. But this is the type of ignorance that this man engages in. Now, I want you to Keep this in mind as I continue to read because the contradictions will be ever more glaring. Been fighting critics and scrutiny since 2012. I can't even read comments on social media anymore. Let's pause here for a second. If you're going to be a public figure, you have to understand that if you want that fame, if you want that popularity, you have to understand that there are people that are going to disagree with you and criticize you. And in a free society, you have to allow for dissent because you can say what you say. But now all of a sudden, since people are criticizing you and not everyone is agreeing with you, by the way, Mr. Prima Donna, you have to understand that they too have a right to their opinion. Well, yes, they might have a right to an opinion, but their opinion is not right. Well, explain that. Do not continue to try to dismiss their arguments by basing your counter arguments on their intentions or by condescending to them by saying you don't have the same experiences that I have, so therefore you can't comment, instead of directly addressing the substance of their commentary. That's disingenuous, and on many occasions, that's actually a sign that a person has embraced a falsehood, but even though they have now been proven by persons whom reprove them that they are embracing a falsehood, they continue to embrace it no matter what, and now try to vilify the person that has brought them to account. That's dangerous. That's absolutely dangerous. By the way, returning to what I just said, think about this, folks, for just a second. These people, when they achieve the pinnacle of success and they are perched up in their towers of fame and fortune and whatnot, you can't disagree with them because they come to believe the lie that says the following: look at the amount of people that follow me. Obviously, what I have to say has to be based in truth. Otherwise, I wouldn't have this mass following. Well, it could just be a case that you're an ignoramus and the people that follow you are ignoramuses as well. Have you ever thought about that? And that goes to all people whom are in celebrity culture. He continues to say, all the slander is too much for any one person to digest. Slander? So you're attributing their criticisms of the ideology that you have embraced as slander? Slander is when you speak evil of a person when there's no reason to. Slander has everything to do when you defame an individual. But when they are criticizing your posture, your position on a matter, that's not slander. What they're doing is that they are criticizing the substance of what you have to say, of what you believe. That's not slander. They're simply addressing your belief system. Slander is saying you're a murderer when you're not. Slander is saying you are a racist when you're not. By the way, isn't that what Black Lives Matter does systematically? Slander other people and lie about incidents? Because this is the same man who spoke about Philando Castile, who also says in this very same op-ed, he mentions Mike Brown and Eric Garner. Folks, Mike Brown, obviously, Lecrae has bought into the lie, into the Black Lives Matter lie, into the narrative. Why? Mike Brown was no gentle giant. It wasn't hands up, don't shoot. He stole cigarillos from a local convenience store, and then the cameras showcased the way he roughed up the owner of that store when he tried to make him desist from stealing those cigarillos. And obviously he had marijuana in his system. Doesn't matter what his mother says to this point, which, by the way, there's also other narratives that have come out of that camp where she went, and if I'm not mistaken, her mother-in-law, her ex-mother-in-law, was selling Justice for Michael Brown t-shirts, and she went on with a posse. She brought back a posse and beat her up for selling those t-shirts. And Mike Brown died because he aggravated a police officer. He took the gun that Darren Wilson had in his hand and he wanted to turn it on Darren Wilson to kill him. Philando Castile, initially he only had minor incidents with the law, 55 of them to be precise, mostly traffic violations. Oh, and then we have Got News. And the things that I'm mentioning in this video and in this podcast, by the way, you'll find the sources in the description below, folks, so that people won't accuse me of inventing these things out of thin air. These are all very well documented. Got News, Charles C. Cook over at Got News, he was able to collect a good amount, a treasure trove of data on Philando Castile, a man whom associated with the Crips. That's right, the gang, the Crips. And his then girlfriend, at the time when she was showcasing everything, that entire traffic stop on Facebook, She also glorifies the fact that she was constantly taking weed. And while she was streaming through Facebook, she says, we were stopped because supposedly we have a broken taillight and we just have some weed in the car with a child in the car. That is Philando Castile, the man whom supposedly was an extremely, and remember the narrative, he was a loving guy. He used to serve people in the local cafeteria at the school where he works at. Check the description below to see the kind of person that Philando Castile was. So obviously, it's obvious that Lecrae has bought into the specious narratives, and that is what he is advancing. He's an ignoramus. I navigate different cultures daily, and I understand how people can make false assumptions because of their lack of interaction with the cultures I find myself in. That's very presumptuous, don't you think? And very generalized. How do you know that other people that assist your concerts and buy your music and have given you the very comfortable living that you are enjoying nowadays aren't in touch with the same culture that you've been in touch with? How do you know that? That's very presumptuous of you, very condescending of you. But if they don't frequent these spaces much, how can they rush to judgment? Again, that's very presumptuous. Besides, I ask you, is it necessary to have an experience with heroin in order to say heroin is bad? Is it necessary to contract an STD in order to say having free sex, being a promiscuous individual is bad? It's bad for you? I don't think so. I hit a serious low on tour at one point. I was done with American Christian culture. No voice of my own, no authenticity. I was a puppet. And yet you continued to be that puppet? Whose puppet are you? Are you admitting that you were falsifying your past in order to make inroads into popular culture so people can buy your music? I'd like to know. I'm just asking a question. I'd seen so much fakeness from those who claimed to be my brothers and sisters that I didn't even know how to talk to my Heavenly Father. Notice how he misattributes, again, people disagreeing with him on the matter of racial reconciliation from the vantage point of a racist black. I'm not saying he is necessarily racist. What I'm saying is that he has embraced the ideology of people whom are racist, which, again, I say necessarily because I don't know the man's heart. I'm simply going off of his history. God knows his heart, and he knows his heart better than I do. I haven't been, I'm going to tell you, I'm not a fanatic. I'm not a fanatic of Lecrae, but I'm simply examining him by his own words. And then there was Mike Brown, then Eric Garner, and then number, and then he leaves a blank space, and then number, and he leaves another blank space and another blank space. People kept killing us. Boy, is that a broad statement. People kept killing us. You're killing the black brethren. Really? Really, when it is known statistically that more whites die at the hands of police shootings for incidents, for their committing criminalities, in the majority of cases, than blacks do, whom die at the hands of police officers when they are confronted because they have committed a criminality. But interestingly enough, when we match those statistics, when we look at the statistics, blacks make up a great portion of the criminality in the United States, even though they make up only 12 to 13% of the demographics in the USA, of the population. I have a report here that comes to us from the Washington Times, and this is an excerpt from the book Please Stop Helping Us by Jason Riley. By the way, for those of you who don't know Mr. Riley, he is black, and he has studied this on end, so I would ask you to consult the book. But this is an excerpt. Quote, today blacks are about 13% of the population and continue to be responsible for an inordinate amount of crime. Between 1976 and 2005, blacks committed more than half of all murders in the United States. The black arrest rate for most offenses, including robbery, aggravated assault, and property crimes, is still typically 2 to 3 times their representation in the population. Blacks as a group are also overrepresented among persons arrested for so-called white-collar crimes such as counterfeiting, fraud, and embezzlement. And blaming this decades-long, well-documented trend on racist cops, prosecutors, judges, sentencing guidelines, and drug laws doesn't cut it as a plausible explanation. Even allowing for the existence of discrimination in the criminal justice system, the higher rates of crime among black Americans cannot be denied, wrote James Q. Wilson and Richard Herrnstein in their classic 1985 study, Crime and Human Nature. Every study of crime using official data shows blacks to be overrepresented among persons arrested, convicted, and imprisoned for street crimes. This was true decades before the authors put it to paper, and it remains the case decades later. Folks, and please don't misunderstand me and don't put words into my mouth. I'm not saying that all blacks are criminals. That is not what I am saying. But what I am saying is that there is a general tendency within black culture to promote and be violent. through their music, their culture, the movies, etc. This is undeniable. And simply trying to dismiss an argument by saying, you're a racist, that's not a sign of a counter-argument, and it's not going to make me desist from speaking the truth. Besides, people who say you're a racist, they don't even know whom your associates are, whom the people you hang around with. For all those people know, I could be surrounded by black persons. Those are probably a part of my innermost sanctum of friends. They don't know that. It's a very specious and disingenuous way to try to dismiss an argument. But they know that most people just are afraid of being called racist. I don't know why. If you're not that, then it shouldn't affect you. But anyways, as I shared my heart, my supporters turned on me even more, fans and friends. There was no empathy. Well, maybe there's a reason. Why don't you attribute it to the fact that you are embracing a falsehood of an ideology instead of saying you don't understand me? Again, dismissal of an argument without addressing the argument itself, the substance of the argument, is very disingenuous. Though some comments were just evil and hurtful. For example, others were steeped in ignorance and lack of perspective. The other thing is, once again, he generalizes. He's saying that all people whom have a contrarian opinion to Lecrae's, they're either evil or hurtful because of the comments that they showcase, or they're steeped in ignorance. So Lecrae has the absolute knowledge, the what shall we call it, concrete knowledge about this situation. They didn't get it. Once again, condescending. I mean, if I were a person that has consumed Lecrae's music and bought any of his materials, I'd be throwing it in the dumpster right about now because of his, what shall we say, his view of me. My mother, my relatives, and closest friends have risked their lives in the area of law enforcement and corrections. So I will never say I hate the police. I know that it's a culture of its own with many nuances that the average person can't grasp. Again, with the condescension. I mean, it's amazing. Still, I have had enough experience with an exposure to our policing system to know that it is extremely fractured and the infrastructure is far from fair and just. Well, that's the case in every aspect of existence, not just police forces, but also within the church. How many false teachers are among us? How many false pastors are among us? False apostles? How many Christians do we have among us whom pretend to espouse the accurate gospel, the true gospel, when they're not necessarily following it? Yes, there are many corrupt police officers, just as there are many corrupt pastors, just as there are many corrupt singers and rappers. I've been pulled over, but that doesn't mean that all of them are, because I could say, since Lecrae, he's an ignoramus, all rappers are ignoramuses. Even though, if we're talking about celebrities, the general rule of thumb is I've been pulled over before a show, spoken to like I was less than human, unlawfully searched for drugs, and left to put my destroyed car back together and make it to my show as the cops drove off. I had an incident once when I was younger where I was accused of skipping school. Police officers, they patted me down. They committed battery against me. And yet, I harbor no ill will towards police officers. I just denounce the unjust among them. I don't go around saying all police officers. But Gio, he never said all police officers, but read his words. He's generalizing. The reason that he uses the disclaimer is to evade that criticism from people whom will point out, accurately enough, that he is generalizing. But in his words, through his own words, he pierces himself. I've had a police officer place his knee on my throat as he told me to tell him where a gun that I didn't possess was. But was this after your conversion or before your conversion, where you were engaged in criminality, as he has said before? My brother and fellow artist Trip Lee was outside of one of his own concerts and was pushed around and had guns drawn on him because he fit a description. These are just a few of some of the many infractions I can name. Yes, so if any police officer does something illegally, they ought to pay for it. It's plain and simple, but this is not proof of systematic racism. I think the statistics prove all of the opposite. What it proves is that there is a general tendency in black culture to be violent, promiscuous, drug-taking, etc. It's the very thing that you supposedly lyricize against, Lecrae. You can't have it both ways. Does this indict all officers? No. But does the consistency of infraction tell me the system, not just a few individuals, is flawed? Yes. We already addressed that. That's why I declare Black Lives Matter! Exclamation point. Understand there is a distinct difference between the organization BLM and the sentiment BLM. My agreement with the sentiment is not my endorsement of the organization. Oh, Oh, all right. Let's try to apply that principle universally, shall we? Let's say that I agree with the phrase or the title of the group, Ku Klux Klan, but I don't agree with the group. I don't subscribe to the group's ideology. I just like the phrase. I subscribe to the phrase Ku Klux Klan. What would people say of me? I think the listener and the viewer would arrive at the appropriate conclusion if they submit to common sense. They would say, no, it's indistinguishable. You cannot separate one thing from another. Well, the same principle applies here, Lecrae. The exact same principle. Rather, the statement encapsulates our societal woes as a people. Again, we've already proven that that's not the case. I don't condone violence or rioting for which BLM is so often blamed. And I don't believe these isolated acts express the values of the BLM organization or the sentiment either. Yet some people think that we are just whining about the past. Yes, you are. You are whining about the past and attributing blame to where it does not belong, which I will prove in just a second. But we're not. We are trying to expose how the past has affected the present and threatens the future. Can people not see it? If you enslave and torture a people for 400 years, tell them that they are free, but torture them another 100 years, and then kind of give them rights begrudgingly 50 years ago, how can you expect zero systematic effects? You can't wipe away a 500-year trauma in 50 years. It's funny because Lecrae criticizes other Christians for not being Jesus-like, as he sees Jesus being. Well, I ask you, Lecrae, where is your being Jesus-like when you don't forgive? Jesus did say to forgive 70 times 7. And Jesus also says to judge with righteous judgment. And the Bible says that all injustice is sin. So when you are attributing blame to people that should not have the blame, that's unjust. And continuing to remind yourself of a past that you did not suffer, maybe some of your ancestors did, and I say maybe because I'll clarify that even more with historical facts. Maybe some of your ancestors suffered in the past. And instead of forgiving that when reparations have already been made, I think that that is evidence of resentment, espousal of resentment. Very clear to me. Let's return here for a second to the historical documentation. It is known that up until the Civil War, there were probably just as many blacks as there were whites whom owned black slaves. This is covered in the documentary sources that I have down below. Look at the links. It is also known that in the United States, there were more white indentured slaves than there were black slaves up until the point of the Civil War. All you need to do is look up the facts. I never learned that in school. There's a lot of things that they didn't teach you in school. Just like, for example, Martin Luther King Jr., a man whom is idolized nowadays as a patron saint of the civil rights movement when it was known that he was a rampant philanderer, an abuser of women. Furthermore, a man whom slept with his associates' wives and was a person whom espoused socialist communist viewpoints. Don't believe me? Research the data. It's all there. As a matter of fact, if I'm not mistaken, the FBI has sealed those wiretaps against Martin Luther King Jr. up until the year 2027, if I'm not mistaken. All you have to do is research the documentation, folks. And I don't hear Lecrae speaking out against Muslims throughout their history, from very early on, enslaving white Christian Europeans. I don't hear him speaking about the Andalusian experiment, how Muslims enslaved Christians, tortured them, and killed them. I don't hear him speaking about that. I don't hear him speaking about the Armenian genocide, how Muslims systematically have imprisoned and enslaved more white persons than Americans enslaved black persons throughout its history. By the way, you know who were the people that were selling blacks in the slave market from Africa? Their fellow blacks. But that he does not advance. Obviously, he doesn't subscribe to that because of his words. His words denounce him. Either that, or he does know the history and he chooses not to propagate it, which that is evil. I don't know which is which. All I am saying is that I'm putting that out there because there are people who know the past, but they repress the truth in unrighteousness. We can't wipe away a 500-year trauma in 50 years. That's why I called it at the beginning of this podcast. It's racial purgatory. There's nothing that anyone can do in order to finally say, we've made reparations, we've made penance. Can we please stop already with the reparations racket? Can we stop? It's never enough. You always need help. At one point or another, it's demeaning to your humanity. But just as I don't hate cops, I'm not mad at white people. But I am disturbed at the supremacy and disparities that still exist. You see, that's my point. He tries to say, no, I don't hate these people, but it's like saying, I'm a supporter of the Second Amendment, but if you're a supporter of the Second Amendment, which says the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, it's a very overarching and absolute statement. Then if you use the term, the word but, and then add a clarifying statement to say, I support regulations, etc., you're not in favor of the Second Amendment. Don't say you're in favor of the Second Amendment, because you're not. It's the same thing. And what's ironic is that I'm so bothered because Jesus actually challenges me not only to care for the souls of all humanity, but to feed the hungry, aid the sick, regard the stranger, visit the prisoner, and love my neighbor in tangible ways. But he doesn't tell you to attribute blame to people that are not to blame. He doesn't tell you to advance a specious, racist narrative either. He doesn't tell you to do those things. But yet you're doing it by advancing this specious and racist, demagogic, charlatanesque ideology. Honestly, the pains of humanity have been draining me, and if that wasn't enough, I had to bury my 34-year-old cousin. We grew up together, pledged in college together, and found God together, and in a moment, his life was taken. On top of that, a longtime friend betrayed by trust. Life has been really crumbling over the past year, which brought on depression and so many doubts. All I've had was music, etc., etc. He wanted to quit. Well, anyways, I want to end with this, folks. Here are a couple of notes that will prove, furthermore, that this man... I wouldn't listen to him. I would desist from listening to him because many of the things that he advances are just, they're downright not only stupid, but dangerous. Very dangerous. In an article titled, "Rapper Has Choice Words for Christians Whom Don't Want Him to Talk About Race," and this is where I was able to find the quote that he places on Instagram, you'll find that it mentions that on July 4th of this year, he tweeted out a photography of black children slaves. And the caption, which he wrote, reads, "My family on July 4th, 1776. Lecrae, I got a secret for you. You might want to fix this because this is a problem. Photography. I don't know if you've noticed, but in 1776, most people painted because at that point, photography was, if I'm not mistaken, it was either non-existent or in its very, very primitive stages. So the photo that you posted there was probably from the Civil War era, not from 1776. That's number one. Number two, everything I've just mentioned about the history of black slavery, that he doesn't mention. Again, if we are to forgive and forget like Jesus tells us to do, forgive 70 times 7, why does he continue to repair on the past? Why does he continue to think upon the past and reliving the past when he hasn't lived it? Again, Lecrae, I ask you, who caused you to engage in a life of criminality? Was it whites or was it people whom you said influenced you like Tupac? That's number one. Last but not least, be very careful with these people because their hypocrisy is very glaring, folks. One of the things that made Lecrae very popular was his appearing in a 2011 BET Hip Hop Awards cypher. And he was a contributing rapper on the album by disc jockey Static Selector and the album Population Control. Might I amuse the viewer and the listener with some of the lyrics whom some other rappers contributed to Static Selector's album in which Lecrae participates in? This is from the track titled Groupie Love. Quote, "I got a big bottle of Henny's that's going to get me drunk. I see a couple of sluts. They're probably getting expletive." And speaking about the sexual act, "I don't mean to be rude. I like to joke a lot. I keep a butt naked female dog chilling home with pot because she know I like to party that way. We celebrating like it's my last day." Folks, be careful with those in celebrity culture, especially in Christian celebrity culture, which is so paradoxical. If you think about it, so ironic, oxymoronic even. The focus of Christianity ought to be, or biblical Christianity, true Christianity ought to be Jesus Christ, not these celebrities in our midst. Lecrae is the result, folks, of the glorification of black culture in our society. Why? Well, a story of a sordid and rough past sells more discs, sells more books than a life that did not submit to the criminal element. Think about it. Even in the church, this has happened. Christians tend to glorify and put on a pedestal the testimonies of God saved me from a life of criminality. And when a Christian says, my parents educated me from a very early age, and they, through their instruction in godly principles, taught me to maintain myself unspotted from the world, we say about that testimony, we don't say it with these words, but we say, doesn't sound as scandalous, as dramatic. There's a reason why in the lyrics it's constantly alluding to how bad things are, and the criminal life, and the pot taking, and the sexuality, etc. There's a reason why they continue to talk about these things. But that's to Christianity's shame. And what I mean by Christianity is not by the actual Christianity, that the faith that was left to us by Jesus Christ, but rather people whom are Christians themselves. When we ought to be saying, you see, you ought to be more like these people. You ought to be more like these Christians that from an early age, their parents taught them to stay unspotted from the world, and they did not taste the world because of it. But no, here we continue to flock to people whom have had sordid past, etc. Again, I'm not trying to underestimate their testimony in any way, shape, or form. I am pointing out the inconsistency and the hypocrisy and the underestimation that certain Christians have in general against those that have said, I'm a living testimony of how God can preserve a life if we just pay attention to what he tells us. We don't have to descend into that sort of behavior in order to say, don't behave this way. I'm living testimony of that. I'm living proof of that. No, we don't want to hear that. That's not scandalous enough. It's not sensational enough. It's not dramatic. Give me the life of the pervert. Give me the life of the former pedophile. Give me the life of the former porn addict. Give me the life of the former drug taker, of the former criminal, etc. The former celebrity who came to Jesus Christ, etc. Give me that. He is also the result of the glorification of the black culture. Why? Because that is what hip-hop has advanced for the last 30 years. And since he includes that, and he himself has said that his music is not necessarily Christian, but that he's a Christian. So he took the motto, if you will, from hip-hop, which is the glorification of criminality in black culture and that debased culture. He turned it on its head by saying he's criticizing it, renouncing that, if you will, saying, what's the term I'm looking for here? Denouncing that, rather. Denouncing that. And he found a following. By the way, Lecrae, one more time. Remember that the people that mostly buy your music are whites. Remember that. I had other notes, but I think we've pretty much covered it in this edition, folks. I think everything I've needed to say is covered in this edition. The only thing I can leave you with is this. Be very careful. Be very wary. Take care that you are not deceived. Jesus told us once and again, do not be deceived. It's a continual commandment given by Jesus Christ. Hebrews 5:14, exercise your discernment daily so that you can differentiate between good and evil. Not everything what's the old adage say, not everything that shines is gold. Not everything that looks brilliant is gold. Well, even certain people whom say they're Christians, I'm a Christian and I'm speaking from a purely Christian perspective, not everything that says it's coming directly from the scriptures is. Be very careful with that. Thank you, folks, for granting us these moments during your day to listen to absolute veracity, absolute truth in a world full of uncertainty. My name is Gio. Please remember to visit our website, redlettersdialogues.com, redlettersdialogues.com. Remember to subscribe if you are watching us through YouTube to the channel so you would be alerted when we post new videos on a weekly basis. Also subscribe to our email list so that you would be among the first to know when we are posting articles or the resources, etc. And last but not least, help us economically. Every month we are asking persons to have a subscription of $10 a month, small fee to keep us afloat financially. And if you can't do that, donate one time by visiting our website, redlettersdialogues.com, and subscribing, donating one time. Questions or comments down below, or email us, info@redlettersdialogues.com. Until the next occasion that we meet, may the Lord shine his face upon you and Godspeed.